From Sarah L., nurse. I always knew I was going to be a nurse. It was kind of a family tradition. My mom was a nurse, my aunt was a nurse, even my grandma was a nurse. Honestly, it felt like a requirement more than a choice. But as I walked into the halls of St. Joseph's Hospital for the first time as an employee, I quickly realized that no amount of family legacy could have prepared me for the chaos that awaited me. St. Joseph's Hospital at first glance doesn't look like much. The building is old. No, scratch that, it's ancient. It's the kind of place where the walls have seen better days. I'm talking cracked tiles, peeling paint, and hallways that always smell like a mix of antiseptic and old furniture. You know, that dusty, musty smell that clings to the air like it's never going anywhere. It's not charming, it's creepy. But there's a kind of comfort in that. It's like the building has been through hell and back, but it's still standing, just like the staff. We're all a little worn, a little ragged, but somehow we keep going. Most of the time we're just trying to get through the day without losing our minds. The positive side? Well, it's the people. The doctors, the nurses, the patients, even the grumpy janitors who swear they could run the place better than anyone else. They all make it worth it. But let's not sugarcoat it too much. Working in an ER, especially at a hospital like St. Joe's, isn't for the faint of heart. It's not just the physical exhaustion, though trust me, after a 12-hour shift, your body feels like it's been run over by a truck. It's the emotional toll, the stress, the moments when you're doing chest compressions on someone you know isn't going to make it, but you push forward anyway because that's your job, that's what you're trained to do. But then there are the nights when you're stuck with the paperwork, trying to fill out forms for a patient who doesn't have insurance, and you're literally praying they don't see you roll your eyes, or when you get a family member of a patient who's convinced the hospital staff is out to kill them. It's those moments when I wish I could crawl into a hole and just stay there. And let me tell you, nothing in the textbooks prepared me for the first time I had to deal with someone choking on their own vomit. That was fun. But here's the thing, the longer you work in this kind of environment, the more you get used to the madness. You learn to block out the chaos, to focus only on the task at hand, and to laugh about it later, because if you didn't laugh, you'd cry. By the time I hit the end of my shift, I was mentally drained. I don't know how people do this day in and day out without losing their minds, but I've learned a trick. When the shift ends, you walk out the door like you're escaping prison. Don't look back, just go. I needed something to unwind, so I called up my friend Mike. Mike and I go way back. He's the kind of friend who knows when you're stressed without you having to say a word. He also knows the power of a good weed session after a particularly rough shift. I stopped by his place and we cracked open a bottle of whiskey for him and a joint for me. As we sat on his couch, I could feel the tension start to melt away, the weight lifting from my shoulders. Mike, always the comedian, was telling me some ridiculous story about a patient he'd had earlier. Something about a guy who tried to sneak a live chicken into the ER for emotional support. I laughed until I cried. It's funny how absurd things get when you work in a hospital. You have to laugh, or you'll end up losing it. The weed kicked in, and I let the calm wash over me. We didn't talk about work much because we both knew how that conversation would end. Instead, we just sat there, cracking jokes and trying to forget the endless barrage of trauma we had both witnessed earlier that day. Mike passed me another joint, and I took a long, slow drag. "You ever wonder how we ended up here?" I asked him, staring up at the ceiling. Mike, in his usual philosophical tone, looked at me and said, "I think it's because we both realized we're too lazy to do anything else." We laughed, and for a moment, it was just two people who had survived another day in the madness. I had just finished a long night of rounds, and my nerves were completely shot. I had dealt with the usual madness, patients demanding pain meds every 5 minutes, a misbehaving IV line, and a doctor who had no idea what he was doing, but acted like he ran the whole place. But none of that compared to what I'd experienced in room 213. I had barely managed to put the unsettling encounter out of my mind when my shift finally ended, but as I was about to leave, my supervisor, Claire, asked me to stick around for a bit longer. Of course, I had no choice but to agree. "I need you to check on something in room 213. There's an issue with the equipment," Claire said, looking over her clipboard. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Room 213, that cursed room, the one I was not supposed to go near. I froze. "Claire, are you..." Sure? It's been vacant for 10 years. Claire blinked at me. What are you talking about? We just had a new patient in there this morning. My heart skipped a beat. I felt my stomach turn. I could have sworn I heard the whispering, felt the air grow cold, but Claire was already walking off unaware of my growing panic. Reluctantly, I made my way back to the dreaded room. When I reached the door, it was slightly ajar, just like the night before. I braced myself, half expecting something to leap out at me. Slowly, I pushed the door open, ready for whatever horror awaited me inside. But what I found wasn't what I expected. There, lying in the bed, was a man, Richard, the new patient Claire had mentioned. He was, well, let's just say he wasn't winning any beauty contests. Richard was a tall guy, but he had a weird sort of squishiness about him. His skin had the texture of an old sofa that had been left out in the rain, and he looked like he hadn't seen sunlight in a decade. His eyes were sunken. His hair, if you could call it that, was greasy and stuck to his scalp like wet paper. And when he smiled, I swear, it looked like he was trying to hold back a laugh, but was failing miserably. "Sarah, help me," he whispered. His voice was like gravel scraping against a chalkboard. I stifled a laugh because, honestly, he looked like the kind of guy who'd go out for a smoke and forget to come back. But I had to stay professional, so I leaned in. "Richard, what's the matter? Are you okay?" I asked, trying to hide the amusement. That's when things went from strange to downright bizarre. He suddenly grabbed my wrist with what can only be described as a surprisingly firm grip for a guy who looked like he was 3 bad meals away from collapsing. And in a voice so quiet I could barely hear him, he hissed, I need you to get me out of here. The room. It's not right." Before I could react, he gave me a look, this creepy, wide-eyed deadpan stare, and said, "I think the ghosts are trying to hire me as a ghost consultant." My brain stopped for a moment. Did he really just say that? I tried to pull my wrist free, but Richard had locked onto me like a toddler grabbing a candy bar. It was like I was stuck in some low-budget ghost movie, only the ghost was weirdly into consulting. I pulled away and looked at him. "You're kidding, right? You're not serious." But Richard wasn't smiling anymore. In fact, his face twisted into something disturbingly grim. "Wait, do you hear that?" he whispered again, this time looking around the room as if expecting something to appear. Just as I was about to ask him what on earth he was talking about, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible knocking coming from the closet. I backed away, slowly, trying to keep it together. But Richard wasn't backing away. No, he was now staring at the closet with such intensity I thought he was going to set it on fire with his mind. Then, in his gravely voice, he whispered, "Do you think they'll let me sit on their advisory board? Or at least pay me in ghost stories because, I have a pretty good portfolio." I blinked. Was this guy seriously cracking jokes at a time like this? Just when I thought things couldn't get weirder, the closet door creaked open and out stepped a janitor, dressed in the worst possible uniform with a bucket, mop, and a look of complete confusion. Hey, is everything okay here?" the janitor asked, glancing between me and Richard. I heard some weird noises. Richard didn't even blink. "Oh, nothing, just ghost stuff. You know how it is." I stood there, unable to contain the laugh bubbling up inside me. The janitor, still completely oblivious, nodded slowly. "Well, I'll let you two do your thing," he mumbled and began to shuffle out of the room. As soon as he left, I turned to Richard. "So, ghost consultant, huh? That's a new one." Richard just grinned. "It's a competitive market, but hey, they do offer health benefits." I couldn't help but laugh, despite the bizarre and creepy atmosphere. The whole situation was just too much. It was like the universe had taken the most terrifying thing I'd ever witnessed and turned it into a punchline. I left the room in a daze, still chuckling to myself. As I headed out of the hospital, I pulled out my phone and texted Mike, "Worst shift ever." But also, I may have just had the weirdest encounter with a ghost consultant. Mike's reply came almost immediately. LMAO. You mean to tell me your hospital has ghost consultants now? What's next, zombie therapists? I couldn't help but laugh again as I made my way to Mike's house. After a night like that, all I wanted was to sit back, smoke, and relax. So when I arrived, Mike greeted me with the usual, "You look like you've seen a ghost," as he passed me a joint. "Well, I kinda did," I said, collapsing onto his couch. Mike raised an eyebrow. "You've got to be kidding me." But I wasn't. That was the last time I ever went near room 213. Maybe it wasn't ghosts haunting it. Maybe it was just a crazy guy named Richard who wanted to make a little extra cash as a ghost consultant. And honestly, I kind of hoped he got hired. I kind of